The Annulus, Gen1 series by Shaquille Smith. After Leot sealed the portal, closing the now divided ones and the Annulus into the new world, the place where her brother killed her father, their home. In the morning it was bright, but no sun. At dusk it was gloom, but no darkness. Mankind was divided. They who had escaped mental slavery will now have to live knowing that their brothers, sisters, mothers, and fathers are all gone. Years passed, and humankind settled, bringing forth a new generation of peace. But even with the portal sealed, Serpha still manages to rip small holes inside the realm, sending puppets in to cause terror. They would destroy villages and extract the people's essences, killing them instantly. The successors and leaders fought, but they were no match, and Leot was powerless against the evil that came. She decided to sacrifice her life, dividing herself into spirit animals to use as a beacon to pull more energy from the Annulus. The successors and leaders gain enormous strength, with the Annulus now forcing power through them, enhancing their elemental might. From the spirits, a fighting style represented by each animal was able to destroy the puppets. The leaders and the successors from each tribe form a council. Together, they come as one to forever fight a common enemy. As the years passed, the tribes grew more robust, and they developed a philosophy called the Way of the Annex. Through this, they studied the flow of connection and the animal fighting style called the Kudaven. Chapter 2, Time Tell Tales. A shuffling of gravel stirred Kimari back to consciousness. He eased his eyes open, and a small face hovered over him. He startled the young child, and he widened his eyes, curious. "Who are you?" the boy asked in a squeaky voice. "Name's Kimari," he groaned as he pushed himself up, glancing around. He sat in a cot pushed against the wall of a dim dormitory room. "Who are you?" He clasped his hands behind his back and puffed out his chest in pride. "I'm Koji, son of Mutabaruka." The door cracked open, and a slew of guardsmen stormed into the room. The first one grabbed Kimari's arm, digging his nails into his flesh. Kimari hissed as the guards yanked him from the bed, yelling at the child to leave. They gave him a sharp shove, tying his hands behind his back and directing him out of the room and down the hall. "Where are we going?" Kimari growled, struggling against the bonds behind his back. "Silence!" the guards bellowed. Boots echoing, they crossed into a room, illuminated only by two overhanging bulbs. His face burned, and his chest heaved as anger coursed through him. Panic bit at his stomach. He glanced around, trying to figure out where he was. A group of people sat on marble chairs atop a high podium. They stared at Kimari with frowns of varying disgust, as if he were a chunk of meat. "Hey, where am I?" Kimari blurted out, with a voice dripping with authority, despite the gnawing fear. Two guards shoved Kimari to the ground, and pain exploded in his knees as he hit the concrete floor. But he schooled his face into neutrality, refusing to show any fear or pain. "Bow to the council," Toma said, voice a low husk. The members of the council exchanged looks with one another, brows furrowed, shrugging shoulders. The unsettled environment sent Kimari's heart thundering against his ribs. Kyoki Silver Fox groaned and clicked his tongue. "Why do you bring us this shit from the Earth Realm?" He tossed his hand at Kimari as if he were rotten fruit. Toma rolled his eyes from where he sat with the council on the high podium. He pointed to Kimari's face tattoo. "He has the mark." Gasps bounced around the room, and the council members' jaws dropped, eyes wide. They leaned forward, staring at Kimari, each examining the tattoo. But the Izumi leader reeled back into her seat, arms crossed and pursing her lips. "I don't feel a connection. Silver Fox is wrong. It's more like a wash-down closet," she said. A rumble erupted from the other council members as they laughed at the insult and discussed it amongst themselves. Kimari couldn't decipher anything. The Izumi leader kept her sharp, glinting gaze pinned on him. She narrowed her eyes. "He seems just as simple-minded as the rest of the Earth-goas." Kimari wrenched free from the guard's grip, ignoring Toma's growling protests. "You come down here and say that to my face, bitch." Within a split second, Izumi materialized before him, the wind swirling around her, the only other evidence of her speed. There was a crack, and he cried out as her hand connected with his face. He grunted, wincing. He couldn't understand how she moved so fast. "It's Lord Onengawa to you, shit!" she barked low and menacingly. Spit splattered his face. She turned back to the other leaders. "Let's have him join the Phantom Dua," Izumi bellowed, her lips curling into a sneer. Silence rang out throughout the room for several eternal beats. The other leaders muttered to one another. "No!" Silver Fox snapped, throwing his arms in the air. His voice dripped with distaste. "This man will defile the tournaments." Izumi threw a glare at Toma, who chewed his lips. "Well, we'll see if Toma is right, and if this Earth Realm shit deserves the mark." Meanwhile, Baza folded his arms, scrunched his nose, and let out an annoyed grunt. "Can someone explain what the hell is going on?" Kimari barked, flaring his nose. Toma sighed. "You will participate in a tournament to determine if you are worthy of the mark. The tournament is called Phantom Dua, typically assigned for people not of the Annex bloodline." "It gives people a shot at leadership," Kyoki sneered at Kimari and chuckled. Toma tossed Kyoki a dirty look. He clasped his hands behind his back and stood up, slinking down the podium stairs, and approached Kimari, where he still kneeled. "At the moment, you have limited use of your power," Toma said, voice low, ignoring the petty jibes and insults from the rest of the council. "With such restrictions, you will be a dead man if you join the tournament now." Kimari tightened his jaw. "Didn't think you would care." Toma rolled his eyes. "We must venture off the Earth Realm to consult the shaman known as the Third Eye Rasta. He will untangle the flow of connection so you can harness the full force of your powers, so you will have control over it." Kimari narrowed his eyes. Swallowing this new information, but not speaking, Kyoki materialized next to Toma. "I would like to join." "I thought you hated me," Kimari scoffed. Kyoki crossed his arms and let out a braying laugh. "I would like to see this all for myself to believe it." Toma massaged his temples, closing his eyes. "As long as you promise to be civil, Kyoki, we must perform the exile ritual now." Kimari held his breath, and his pulse roared in his ears as the two council leaders prepared to perform the exile ritual, separating their connection with the Annulus and shielding them from Serpha's watchful eye. Toma cleared his throat, placing his hands on both Kimari's and Kyoki's heads. Toma recited the exile ritual. "Abitene, abit ad bonam, exilium." With a rush of wind and light, Kimari found himself in the blue mountains of Jamaica. Toma brushed the dirt from his hands and marched up to the door of a wooden cabin perched on the side of a cliff, where below lay an expansive evergreen forest. He knocked on the door. While Toma was distracted, Kimari glanced around, spotting a path. He lurched towards it, heart pounding, but a sudden sharp ringing in his ears sent him reeling. He stumbled. Kimari realized his vision blurred on and off. His hearing was dampened and ringing as if he were underwater. Kyoki, who stood only watching, sneered. "Nice try, Earthshit." An enormous man opened the door. His skin was tan and leathered from a lifetime in the sun, but his muscles were bulging from his shirt. He had many old scars on his arms, undoubtedly from many fought battles. Kimari spotted an array of weapons inside his house.
"Toma, nice to see you."
"Will you lead us to the three-eyed Rasta, Chief Kojo?" he asked, shaking the warrior's hand. Chief Kojo smiled and nodded. He gestured for them to follow. Kimari bit his lip, swallowing the torrent of questions he had. Kojo leads the three men down a path behind the back of his house, bathed in buttery sunlight and bordered with plants rising to the knee. There was an array of vegetables and fruit trees. The ground crunched underfoot as they approached a section of path riddled with purple flowers. He grabbed the flower and muttered an indecipherable command. The purple flowers transformed into an expansive forest. Shrouded in shadows, tightly knit trees rose to a momentous height, stretching their limbs in all directions. Birds chirped as they darted amongst the leaves. A faint haze coated the space between the chief's garden and the hidden forest.
"The hidden forest,"
Kojo said with a rasp.
"protected by one of Leo's seals."
Without another word, he crossed the threshold of the seal and gestured for them to follow. Kimari's stomach knotted. As they passed through, the seal disappeared altogether, revealing more of the forest behind them. Chief Kojo leads them through the forest for the rest of the afternoon. Kimari's feet ached. His mouth pleaded for hydration. At last, they arrived. The trees thinned, creating a clearing. Hundreds of strange plants unknown to Kimari burst at the seams of the clearing. An aroma array wafted into his nose, warm and inviting. Chief Kojo bid them goodbye. He slipped away in the direction they came. "Rasta!" Kyoki clapped his hands together and bounded up to a scrawny man materializing from one row of plants. They hugged and slapped one another on the back. Toma grinned.
"I would like to say it's nice to see you, Rasta, but I'm blind."
The three threw their heads back in laughter. "What brings you here?" the Rasta shaman said, wiping the tear from his eye and clutching his stomach. Toma angled his head at Kimari. "We need your help. Something is blocking him from connecting with his full power." The third-eye Rasta frowned at Kimari. He traipsed towards Kimari and circled him, examining him with kind, concerned eyes. "Me garden is home to hundreds of roots and medicinal plants," he said, sensing Kimari's confusion. He swept his hand across the expanse of rows. "Me garden has plants that can heal man every ailment, disease or injury. It can even heal a broken soul. I am forever grateful for the protection of the Leo seal. Without it, man, my garden wouldn't exist. I cannot bear to think of the suffering without healing plants," he cringed. "Not to mention marijuana." Toma leaned against a tree, rolling a joint. Rasta smirked, shaking his head. "Why don't we sit for a meal and discuss what we can do to help you?" Everyone nodded in agreement. The Rasta slipped into a small cottage at the end of the garden and returned with a couple of foldable camp chairs. They helped him pull the chairs apart, and the men sat around, staring at one another. Several awkward beats of silence followed. The Rasta served them a bowl of fried vegetables, each a glass of beer. "So, you're a human with a mark," Rasta said. He chewed and swallowed. A human from Earthrealm with a mark. What a strange coincidence."
Yes, he's rare.
Kyoki said through gritted teeth. He stabbed his vegetables with force, and Kimari wished he could stab him. "You can at least hide your jealousy, Kyoki," Toma scolded, shaking his head. He took a puff of his joint. "It's shameful." "I'm not jealous," the silver fox said, although his cheeks burned red, betraying him. Toma and the Rasta laughed. Even Kimari stifled a chuckle, earning a hateful glare from Kyoki. After finishing their meals, the Rasta stood and asked Toma to follow him. The two men stalked into the shadows of the garden, leaving Kimari and Kyoki alone together. Kimari rolled his eyes at him and turned his attention to the garden. But really, he was eavesdropping on the conversation. "I'm sure he's kind of rare," the Rasta said, voice a low husk. "But me don't think Kimari is the only one." "How so?" Toma crossed his arms over his chest. Rasta shifted his feet and furrowed his brows. "Less than 5 years ago, another human washed up on the shores of the river, south of my garden. And I stumbled across him one morning. He was like Kimari. He had the same mark. His name was John." Toma sucked in a shaky breath. "Where is John now?" The Rasta shrugged. "He didn't let me talk to him. He ran off once he regained his consciousness, and we lost him." "Not as one in a million as we thought," Toma said, "but maybe close enough." The pair finished their conversation and returned to Kimari and Kyoki. "We want to help you access your full potential, Kimari," Rasta smiled, and his weathered eyes crinkled. "Will you let me, man?" "Yes," Kimari said. "Me saying something is blocking you from your power." Kimari mustered his voice. "The power wields from my chest," he said. "Yes, the only blockade will be in your heart, where the connection is the strongest." Rasta drew in a breath and tilted his head, holding his hand over Kimari's chest. "May I?" "You'll leech yourself dry," Toma said. "Careful, Rasta." "You wanted me help, did you not?" He shoots Toma a warning glare. Toma pursed his lips and shifted his weight, letting out a sigh. "Be careful." Rasta glanced back at Kimari and drew in a breath. "Are you prepared for the consequences of having such a great power?" His crow's feet crinkled under the concern. Kimari drew in a breath and mustered his courage. "It'll be okay." Rasta nodded. Then a moment of clarity overtook his face. He was granite with focus. He shoved his hand, which glowed with magic, into Kimari's chest. A cry slipped from Kimari's lips as the Rasta twisted and pulled, muttering something indecipherable under his breath, as if he were praying to the gods. Pain ricocheted through Kimari's chest. He wanted to scream, but he bit his cheek, refusing to show such weakness. His knees gave way, and the Rasta kneeled with him, scuffing the forest floor. At last, the Rasta slowly pulled something from his chest. It was black and slimy. It was dripping heavily like ink, a clump of darkness. The Rasta staggered back, groaning and whimpering. He dropped the black goo onto the ground and slumped against a tree trunk. He slid to the ground, panting until he passed out. Toma hurried up to the Rasta, feeling for his pulse.
He's still alive, but his powers are spent,
Toma said, slumping his shoulders and frowning.
Toma, something is happening to Kimari,
Keoki barked, but his voice wavered with a sliver of fear. His eyes widened and his face drained of color. A glowing shackle materialized around Kimari's neck. Strangled groans tore up his throat. He withered on the ground, yelling. The bond broke in half and crumpled into oblivion. Power billowed from Kimari's chest, plowing through the forest, sending the trees leering back as if sent by a wind. The skies above roared. The lightning flashed, striking the earth like blades of electricity.
Stop, Kimari!
Keoki yelled above the din. But Kimari did no such thing. Lightning illuminated the skies, throwing forks and rumbling the forest. Energy hammered the trees, and some of them caught flame.
Stop!
Toma bellowed above the torrent of energy. But the power swirled into a storm. All Kimari could do was scream and thrash around on the forest floor.
He's out of control.
Keoki slapped Kimari, and his stomach dropped. His eyes glazed over, yet the pupils darted around as if a foreign entity possessed him. Toma marched over, reaching gently for Kimari's face. Heat burned from his temple like a radiator, and sweat coated his forehead.
We're control, Kimari. This is causing immense destruction.
His voice boomed with authority, but Kimari understood none of it. Electricity shot from Kimari, knocking into Toma's chest. It sent him flying back, slamming into the dirt. He stilled.
Now look what you've done.
Keoki snapped, balling his fist. He straightened, and a thought occurred to him. He grinned. Keoki circled Kimari with feline smoothness, rubbing his hands together. His lips curled into a sneer.
I hated you from the moment you stepped into the council. Such arrogance, such audacity.
But Kimari couldn't reply, even if he wanted to. He screamed. The power engulfed his senses, deafening and blinding him to all reason. Keoki shook his head at the zombie-like state the human was in.
Pity. Maybe we could have been allies. But I think we both know I've wanted to fight you since the day we met.
His eyes danced with startling malice as he spat out the words like poison flying from a snake's fangs. Keoki drew in a deep breath and blew out his cheeks. Flames ignited in his eyes, and his tattoo glowed.
Fox style, Kudai then, level 1. Sun greets man,
he yelled to the heavens. Swathed in his power, his eyes changed shape, narrowing at the corners and growing. Flames burned within like a wildfire. His ears grew points, and his teeth sharpened into razors. With a grunt, he launched himself into the air. The sun scorched behind him, shadowing his features. He inhaled before exhaling a ball of fire, spitting and crackling with the sun's heat. Kimari threw his hand towards the sky instinctively. A bolt of lightning slammed into the forest, cascading a dome shield over Kimari, blocking Keoki's fiery attack. Keoki stumbled backward, jaw falling open. He snapped back to attention, and a wave of anger surged through him, fueling his firepower. He flushed red as he drew in yet another deep breath and exhaled.
Fox style, Kudai then, level 4. Falling star.
Keoki shot into the skies and burst from the clouds with speeds faster than Kimari could fathom. Kimari couldn't even sit up. His powers leached his mind. His lightning bolts raged on in the skies, but were no match for Keoki's speed. He slammed his flame fist into Kimari, striking him across the face. Kimari smacked into the ground and crushed the surrounding forest floor. That's when a siren blared through the forest and into the skies. It raised the hairs on his body. His fires extinguished at once. Kyoki plummeted to the ground, but his heart thundered against his chest, and his ears perked on high alert, for he knew what the sirens meant, high-pitched and sharp. The sound scraped against your eardrums like claws and sends fear into the hearts of even the bravest man. The sirens came from the Maroon tribe, sworn to protect the inhabitants of the sacred forest. Serpha had detected them. The siren warned Kyoki that Serpha had sent one of his henchmen to scour the vicinity and most likely slaughter them. He puffed out his chest, tightened his jaw, and willed the searing heat of his power into the palms of his hands. Flames bloomed, dancing and twirling from his hands, waiting and ready. But the twisted sense of foreboding warned Kyoki that the enemy was far more powerful than he thought.
What's this?
Has Serpha located them? Find out next time on the Annulus Gen1 series.